Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I've prepared a little 5-minute little text that I want to read you because I'm not a great speaker in improvisation. The topic that we're going to be discussing, you see in the program, is who owns history. It's banal to say that the European project is about preventing the return of ghosts of the past. But what happens if we start disagreeing about what those ghosts are? We know authoritarian Russia and authoritarian Turkey practice the art of rewriting history, faithful as they are to what George Orwell phrased in 1984 as he who controls the past controls the future. But what happens if in our European realm, within the EU, dividing lines, disagreements, new tensions appear over the very understanding of history? Europe today is awash with historical hang-ups. The name dispute over Macedonia, Poland's law aimed at restricting how the role of Poles in the Holocaust can or cannot be mentioned, far-right politicians in Germany calling for the Berlin Holocaust Memorial to be taken down. Earlier this year in my country, France, there was an intense debate about how Charles Maurras, who's a leading intellectual figure of early 20th century ultra-nationalism, and a man that Steve Bannon admires, by the way, how he should be commemorated. If this is what's been called the post-truth world, it's not just fake news that we're confronted with, but also fake history. Who's to say that with everything that technology allows, virtual history, virtual archives, fake documents, alternative history aren't right around the corner? It makes sense to think about these questions at a conference that's focused on current affairs, on current crises, and not just because Meri, who I once had the pleasure to meet when he was president, not just because Meri was a man so steeped in history. Europe's current problems, its angst, come accompanied with a reappraisal of historical notions that were once deemed rock solid, but don't seem to be so rock solid anymore. Not all of this is new, of course. Revisiting history, doubting history is not a European monopoly. Look at Asia, look at how in Trump's America the Civil War is being debated with new ferocity. But in Europe, there's a particular resonance to all of this, because the European project was forged on the notion of reconciliation and on the effort of overcoming historical hatreds. Consensus based on facts is no longer guaranteed, not just facts about today's events, but facts about the past. Who stands to gain? So we're not going to solve these complex questions in 1 hour, nor are we going to miraculously bring together the many strands of Europe's tapestry of essentially nation-centric historical narratives. But what we can do is think about how important it is to know about each other's history, to know about Estonian history when you're French, to know about Ukrainian history when you're Italian, to know about Greek history when you're German. And there's more at stake than just knowledge or understanding. There's the question of how we define the West today. And we know from history that revisionism of borders or of alliances comes accompanied precisely with revisionism of history. History, or its rereading, is very much part of today's ideological battles, ones whose outcome may determine the very nature of our politics and the survival of a club of democracies. I'm not a historian, I'm simply a journalist, but I've seen close up in Russia how history can be manipulated to achieve political goals in ways that can unleash untold levels of violence, as in Chechnya, as in Syria. I came to this topic of history after visiting museums across Europe and seeing places of memory, Warsaw's Museum of Polish and Jewish History, the Caen Memorial in Normandy near the beaches of the Allied landing, Berlin's memorial to Sinti and Roma, to the Sinti and Roma genocide, just to name a few, and also Tito's museum, Memorial Museum in Belgrade, where there's a miniature of his of his train, a miniature of the train in which he traveled constantly across Yugoslavia to keep the country together. Can we be brought together as Europeans, not only by the memory of armed conflict or horror, but by the memory of accomplishments? Next year will be the 30th anniversary of the 1989 revolutions, and in this beautiful part of Europe, they were singing revolutions. Will we Europeans commemorate those events together? Likewise, have we commemorated together the Greek and the Spanish transitions to democracy, made possible in part because the European project acted as such a powerful magnet? Do we feel concerned by our neighbors' perception of history? What is the historical narrative that binds us, and what are we doing, saying, or pledging for that narrative to be defended? As the Austrian president just said, it's also about acting as Europeans, and owning our history is also part of acting as Europeans. Now, to the panel. We have a great panel, and I'm going to briefly present them, and I'll ask you to applaud each one after I've presented them, so to liven it up. So from Denmark, we have Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, who is a former foreign minister of Denmark. And Uffe, I see you as one of the long-lasting, strong advocates of Western unity and of Euro-Atlantic structures. So we're delighted to have Uffe. Please applaud him for being here.
Thank you.
To my left, we have Marek Tam, who is a professor of cultural history at Tallinn University. Marek, I noticed that you worked, among other things, on the link between politics and memory in Estonia after it regained its independence. And I think that link between politics and memory goes to the heart of some of our discussion today. Please applaud Marek. And from Russia and the US, we have Yuri Slezkin, who is a professor of history at Berkeley University, originally from Russia. And Yuri, we're delighted to have you here because I'm sure Russia will come up in the conversation, but you'll have many other topics that you've worked on. Please give him a round of applause. So I'm going to start with you. If each one of you will have 5 or 7 minutes to give your bullet point response to the question, who owns history, and whether I framed it correctly or not. But Uffe, I'll start with you. Are you as worried as I am about fake history?
Oh, indeed I am, because every so often you see examples of how history is twisted, because history has become, so to say, weaponized. If you ask the question who owns history, we all know Victor owns history. But don't let's get into that. But history is used, of course.
Victors, you mean those who win wars? Yes.
The
okay.
victor.
Yeah. Got that.
That's the. I won't get into the philosophics about that. We have 2 professional historians here. Won't start to step into your field. But I was struck. Natalie, by one of your remarks. You said we are awash. Europe is awash with new tensions. Are they new? We had a Danish poet, philosopher called Piet Hein, who wrote small, beautiful poems, Grooks of Wisdom. And he wrote one that said, if I remember it correctly, we think of our age as the age of all ages, when man had grown modern at last. But what other page among history's pages was so overburdened with past? And it's the fight over the past. It is the creation of narratives that can be used as excuses for acting the way you act. And let me be very specific. There's one story that's running around all the time. And it's one of those stories about what happened at the end of the Cold War. The story is, in its brief version, that Russia was cheated by the West. Russia was promised that with German unification, NATO would not be enlarged. Not 1 inch was one of the sentences. And we are bombarded with solid evidence of this is what happened. Not just from troll factories in Petersburg or from Putin Versteher in Central Europe, but even from American universities and from think tanks and so on. And it's a load of evidence that this is a fact. This is, of course, nonsense, as those of us who were involved in the process know too well. And one very involved person even stood up against this narrative. That was Gorbachev. When Gorbachev, some time ago in an official Russian newspaper, I think it's called Rossiyskaya Gazeta, where he said no promises were given. And one of the persons who are often dragged into this history is my old friend Hans-Dietrich Genscher. And I saw a lot of him, and one of the last times I saw him before he died, a couple of years ago, I asked him about this because, again, we had an American professor touring Danish universities saying, well, I can well understand Putin's behavior because he was cheated by the West. The West created the situation that led to the annexation of Crimea and what have you. And Genscher, he jumped up in his seat and said, that is a lie. I'm so sick and tired of hearing that. Nothing was promised. I was there at those meetings. And it was very important for him to do that. So I'm using this opportunity to say to all of you that what you have to do when you meet that kind of trying to create new narratives, to use history as an excuse for misbehavior now and in the future, stand up against it. Expose it, but stand up against it. And this is, as far as I see it, the right weapon to use against the kind of weaponization of history. Expose all the tricks you meet. Expose all the attempts that are being made in order to create new narratives. And the possibilities of doing so are explosive today. If you look at what the cyber world and the cyber realities present of possibilities, and we have seen how that is used in attacks on our Western systems, on our cohesion. So stand up against it, expose it.
I'll push you just 1 minute on that. Do you, when you say we need to stand up against these false narratives, these distortions, when you look at European leaders, European governments today, do you think they're doing enough to stand up against those distortions?
I think European leaders today are doing too little to do what we just heard before, a wholehearted explanation and defense of the need of European unity. It is not often that we hear a speech from a European leader like the one, and Mr. President, thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. But too few are doing that. It's so much easier to touch the itching ear, as an old psalm writer wrote. But it's too easy. And the new generation, they don't know better. And they are overwhelmed with the kind of fake news that they get over the internet, cleverly ruled by bots and systems that is very, very impressive indeed, but unfortunately that are often used to create the false reality. And when you have heads of state in other parts of the world who base their whole political existence on creating alternative facts or whatever it's called, then I get really worried.
Marek, I'm turning to you now. Do you, as a historian and as an Estonian, do you get the impression that when you travel across Europe, and I'm sure you travel across Europe, that the history of your country, if your part of the world, is something that's understood elsewhere?
well, understood is probably not a correct word. It's about knowing it all. But before we move on, I thought it's risky to invite a professional academic historian to the panel, because we tend to start by scholastic remarks, and I won't be an exception. But please bear with me, because I find somehow the very title of this panel tricky, I'd say. Because first, what do we understand by history? Because history is an ambiguous term. It means both everything that has ever happened before right this moment. In this case, history means past. And then, of course, history means also all representations of the past, the history writing. And therefore, the question is, who owns the past, or who owns the history writing, historical research? And I'm more interested into the first question, who owns the past? But also in this case, is the verb to own a most appropriate one? Because, we all agree nobody can own the past. Problem solved. History as past doesn't belong to anybody. And therefore, I think instead of speaking of ownership, we should talk about relationship with the past. And that's my first point. I believe we do have different type of relations with the past. Myself, as an academical historian, I would say I have an epistemic or academic relations with the past. My aim consists of producing new knowledge about the past, following certain rules, certain procedures, evidence-based, analytical, critical approach, etc. But there can be different relations, for instance, moral relations with the past. In this case, we are not interested about knowledge, but about heroic examples, about examples to follow, to give us new hope, to inspire our present activities, etc. We can have, for instance, aesthetic relations with the past. Then we just admire the past, buildings or monuments or traces of past, heroes, whatever. And then, and that's probably the most important one, we can have a political relations with the past. And in this case, it's not, again, about knowledge. It's about how to legitimize, how to justify our present decisions by referring to past examples, past experiences, past events. And this is a very particular kind of relationship, but I would say fully legitimate. If a politician wants to mobilize his followers by giving examples from the past, fair enough. But I think in this particular case, it's very important not to confuse this relation with the past with the epistemic or academic relations with the past. And our duty as historians, in this case, is to check whether these historical examples, historical narratives, this particular politician is offering to make his argument or her argument, whether they are historically accurate, whether they are evidence-based or just phantasmatic or imaginary and made up. And therefore, I think we have to make these kind of distinctions. And they all, in a way, all those relations, we can have commercial relations, just past as a resource for making money, tourism, etc. But we have to make distinction and not to confuse them. And we have to be critical toward all these different types of relations. But then another question, actually, maybe it's a bit arrogant to ask who owns the history as past. I would rather put it that how past owns us. Because, that's an illusion that past is out there, is, a foreign country. They do things differently there. No, past is part of the present. And as Faulkner put it, past is not even past. And we are constantly sort of haunted by the past, as you said in the beginning. And of course, again, there is different kinds of haunting. It's very clear in the case of traumatic examples. We're still haunted in this very country by the Second World War experience. And it's definitely, it's not possible to understand the Estonian foreign policy of today without referring to our historical experience about 60 years ago. So the past is still with us. And the question is, how do we cope with this past? And again, I think historical research is important here, because we have to work through this past experience in order to move forward. I think Hayden White, the well-known American philosopher of history, who passed away a few weeks ago, said that by choosing our past, we choose our future. And that's very important, I think, that we, by coping with the past, we have to be fully aware about its impact on our future experiences. And actually, I like this definition of the present. Present is a mixture of the experiences of the past and expectations of the future. And this sort of horizon of the future and the space of the past experience is something that defines us. And therefore, it's critical, I think, to be fully aware about how do we relate and how do we cope with the past. And therefore, indeed, past does not belong only to historians, but historians have this very critical position in order to, let's say, control or criticize or check all the other types of relations with the past.
I like that idea of the past owns us. It's, it goes the other way around. But as a historian, an Estonian, and a European, do you think, I mean, it's very difficult to, as I travel across Europe and I have some discussions that relate to this, I find it's very difficult to actually get a sense that we do have a common history. It's an easy slogan that many politicians will use, but actually when you go down to the level of citizens, they relate to their national history, and the notion of a European history is something that's very blurry. You said it's not even a question of understanding the other's history, it's a question of actually knowing it. Do you agree with me that we're struggling with this still today in 2018, and the conference is called The Next 100 Years? So, you know, how in the next 100 years should we approach this question of a common European history?
I would say there is a problem, but I would formulate in a different way, because I don't believe that we need a common European history, at least in a scholarly way. We might need common European history at the school level, at certain museums, etc. But again, from an academic point of view, common history makes me scary. I mean, but what we do need, we need a comparative history of European countries. We have to be aware about different historical experiences. And I think this common, let's say, history of Europe has to be heterogeneous. It has to be polyphonic. It has to be, in a way, complicated, and as our past experiences are complicated. I think just to invent a very happy, heroic narrative of European construction is a fairy tale that we really don't need, I think. And also, I think if somebody says that, you know, oh, it's very bad that they're always rewriting history, this is what historians do. They keep rewriting history. That's what we are paid for.
But based on documents.
Yes, of course. I mean, we have certain procedures how to rewrite history, but historical knowledge is by definition fallible. It's open to be questionized, to be problematized, and history writing will never stop. And that's the good news.
I'm going to open it up very shortly after Yuri has spoken to questions from the audience. So this is your opportunity to ask every question you've always wanted to ask to a historian, to Uffe. Yuri, the notion of the Europe is a patchwork, and history is actually constantly rewritten by historians. There has to be diversity. The notion of a common narrative to all is a scary notion. I saw you react to that, Uffe. From your perspective, is this something you agree with? Are these questions that we're talking about ones that you find, as somebody who comes from Russia, who's working in the US, that you find particularly acute these days?
Well, I agree with Mark that these are not really questions for historians, for professional historians, although perhaps it would be interesting to consider them on occasions such as this one. And I also agree with Mark that it is a peculiar question, who owns history, and that no one does, obviously. And just as obviously we all do, as we collect documents, tell stories, take pictures, save letters, compile family archives, and occasionally inflict some of those things on other people. So the internet retains scraps of our past, and some of us attempt to enter history by writing memoirs or going into politics, journalism, or academia, among other things. But of course, most history, in the second academic sense, is collective. One way to define community is a group of people with a common past, and most durable communities work very hard on their histories, telling, retelling, rewriting, ritually restaging them as a matter of self-presentation and survival. Most memories, to address another part of the organizer's question, most memories are instrumentalized, otherwise what's the point of keeping them? And history is publicly instrumentalized memory. Just again, that's one way to think of it. And so the answer to the question posed by the organizers, should we protect history from political, commercial, and other kinds of instrumentalization, is absolutely by offering our own instrumentalization, assuming for a second that we have the same history in mind. Everyone is doing it and always has. Right? Every year, millions of Jews around the world celebrate events they claim to be historical, from the parting of the waves to the destruction of Haman and his people. Christians and Muslims have laid claim to a substantial part of canonized Jewish history, adding a series of allegedly historical events that are solemnly commemorated on a regular basis in special buildings, some of them extremely large. God is instrumentalized history, among other things. Every church, mosque, and synagogue is a vessel for instrumentalized past. And history is too. And so in the Jewish case, for example, what is sacralized as tribal history, for most Europeans, or rather for most, in this case, Christians and Muslims, it's a combination of universal history based on a particular prophecy and a variety of tribal and political genealogies. But of course, in today's world, the most active generator and propagator of history are states, who do it through compulsory education, public commemorations, monument construction, museum visualization, and sponsorship of artistic and academic production. And I think it's important to remember that national mythologies vary by genre and plot. Like some Jewish and Polish, for example, are primarily about martyrdom, followed by retribution and redemption. Some, including many in Europe, are modestly triumphalist, with a series of historical trials culminating in a reasonably well-adjusted society. Some, such as the USSR early on, or the United States.
Sorry, what do you mean by triumphalist and trials?
By trials, I mean the various trials and tribulations that nations undergo before they arrive at its current state, which is considered to be better than whatever happened before, leading up to ever greater perfection, is what I mean. But that is what I would call, again, modest or parochial triumphalism. And then there is...
Yuri, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Can you give an example of that? This triumphalist narrative?
Most national mythologies in Europe, as we know them. As opposed to, for example, the early Soviet case or the American case, which is triumphalism in the universalist messianic key. And then, of course, in the post-war period, Germany pioneered a historically novel national narrative based on guilt and repentance by transferring certain, I think, Christian and Freudian confession techniques into the ethnic realm. And some Western nations today are, I think, in the process, as most of you know and see, in the process of moving haltingly and inconclusively from the triumphalist to the penitent mode. But to...
Which ones, for example?
Well,
I'm a journalist, so I need concrete examples.
I hear debates among my colleagues in the UK, in Holland, in Belgium, and in most other, indeed, Western countries. Indeed, in the United States, the Messianic triumphalist narrative is being questioned from the position of what one could call the penitent narrative pioneered by in Germany. But again, to get closer to home, most post-Soviet nations have adopted the Jewish-Polish victimization model. Like Azerbaijan, for example, has moved the Khojaly massacre story to the center of its national narrative, consistently referring to it as genocide.
Khojaly is a place in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is now the central, or one of several central events in Azerbaijani history as represented by officials and historians. In the Baltic countries, but then Marek knows a lot more about it than I do, the priority, or at least one of the priorities, is the experience of Soviet-era deportations. And of course, Ukraine has been very successful in instituting and propagating the cult of Holodomor. So that's when it comes to sort of plots in genres. And then perhaps two more sets of criteria. One is that national mythologies vary by the coherence of underlying ideologies. For example, the collapse of communism resulted in the creation of a couple of dozen monoethnic nation states, at least in aspiration, with restored and creatively updated ethnic narratives remarkable for their coherence. And Russia, which is the only rhetorically multinational post-communist state with much of its history up for grabs, with no consensus on such foundational events or non-events, depending on who you're talking to, as the Bolshevik Revolution, Civil War, the Great Terror, de-Stalinization, the fall of communism, and so on. This enhances even further the centrality of the one event most Russians can agree on, which is the Great Patriotic War. And now, to close, I think perhaps most centrally and crucially, national mythologies vary by the amount of power they project and produce. And this is something Marek has alluded to. Very few people outside Estonia have heard of, let alone read, Kalevi Poeg, the Estonian national epic. The English bard became the world's bard when Britain became a world empire, and the same is true of Spain and Cervantes. And so, to be very, very crude about it, there are countries whose academic history is produced for somebody else, by someone else. Most African states are in that category. There are nation states that academically study almost exclusively themselves, including Estonia and most of its neighbors. There are former empires that study themselves plus the worlds they used to own. It's true, like in Spain, history departments, yeah, just a couple more words, or in Portugal, study themselves, plus Latin America or Brazil in the case of Portugal. And finally, there are global empires that study the world. And that was true of the Soviet Union. That's, I think, increasingly true of China, and it's definitely true of the United States. In my own department, the assumption is that the history department at the University of California, Berkeley covers the world. And something is amiss if we don't, if there is a perceived lacuna. And so, to conclude, all history is instrumentalized in both senses of the term, and except that some instruments are more effective than others.
Okay. Uffe, would you like to react to that?
Well, I share Yuri's skepticism when it comes to memoirs, because I remember what Churchill once famously said: "History will treat me mildly. I intend to write it myself." And this also explains, of course, why we need historians. Now, Natalie, you and I, we're both journalists. And I believe you belong to the old trade of journalism like I do, where we believe that there is a truth somewhere, and we do our damn best to find it and to expose it. But we don't have the same instruments that historians have. And therefore, historians have to deal with history. And I reacted to what Marx said about a common history. Because it struck my mind that if, for instance, Karl Bildt, who is sitting there, and I were discussing the history of the piece of land that the Swedes stole from Denmark some years ago, and from where you come, we would have different explanations of that. And history books have for a long time been very different in Sweden and in Denmark on that nasty subject. But a few years ago, a British historian wrote a book called Baltic Shores. Some of you might have read it, and it was very enlightening, because suddenly there was a guy in Britain sitting there writing a story about all the countries around the Baltic Sea. To me, it was an eye-opener, because suddenly you got some of the stories where you could see some of the facts described, because facts they were, where you suddenly saw it from the other side, even the other side of Öresund. I don't fully buy your story there, but still, it's an interesting experiment. But why is it so important right now? It's important because our future will, to a large degree, depend on what kind of narrative is winning when it comes to the Cold War, the past, the last part of the Cold War, how the Cold War ended, what promises were made. In short, what was the basis for this rule-based European order that is now under attack? And if we believe in a rule-based order, like we have in the European Union, and even a multilateral system, that it's also under attack right now, not just by Putin, but by Trump as well. If you believe in the value of such systems, you need to be very serious about who is writing the history and who is telling us exactly upon which basis are things done. For instance, grabbing Crimea or whatever have you. One narrative is, well, there was a referendum going on in Crimea. They decided they wanted to belong to Russia. That's one narrative. Another narrative said, well, yes, Estonia was a Soviet republic for a number of years because the Estonians had a referendum back then and even an election, and they decided that it should be so. Very nice narrative. You still hear it. And still it is part of what political decisions are based upon. Now, Lennart Meri, he understood how important these things were. And therefore, he created, as the first among Baltic leaders, he created a group of historians, a commission, who should look into crimes against humanity, following the international definition of what is a crime against humanity. And in 3 fat volumes described, I have them at home because I was a member of the committee that oversaw the work of the historians. Brilliant work. 3 volumes together about this size, telling the story, putting down the facts. Now, that's what we need, and what is needed very sorely today, why we have so many crazy stories flying around in the air.
I think there was a question over there, if there's a microphone coming. Are there any other questions over here?
Hundreds of other questions.
3. We'll take 3 questions.
Edward Lucas from SEPA. I congratulate the organisers on kicking off on history. But I'm slightly puzzled by the idea that the toolkit is so tidy. Because it seems to me that in most countries, Yuri's excellent typology, it's both and rather than either or. So Russia has a messianic instrumentalization of history dating back to the war, a triumphalist one, also a martyrdom one. And so my question to the panel is, how much does it matter when these versions of history, these instrumentalized national mythologies clash? And how should we approach that? And if this is in our adversaries, how can we exploit it?
Okay, there was a question over here. Andre, just in front, and then we'll go to you.
Thank you. Andrei Sarnik of European Belarus Foundation. Thank you very much for amazing opening panel. And I have a very practical question. Speaking of necessity to expose the fake history, I think it's also very important to protect the verdicts that history has already made for certain events. I remember perestroika times, and the most popular saying was at that time that Russia is a country with unpredictable history, unpredictable past. It is still true, but it is now, we can say it in a very dangerous way. Because I remember that there were several attempts to organize a trial on communism and on all the horrors that were brought with communism. They all failed. Today, they renewed the glorification of Stalin and his times and Great Terror. And we cannot expect in foreseeable future any correct assessment of those times and of those crimes. Vice versa, it is being glorified and it's being exported. And I'm really bewildered to see, especially around the 9th of May celebrations, demonstrations, huge demonstrations in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in European countries with portraits of Stalin and other things, and they're being treated very benignly. So
and your question?
is the question, isn't it time, because it will not be done in Russia or Belarus or elsewhere, isn't it time to take some legislative measures against such things in the West? Because without this kind of legislature, and without what Uffe was saying, that the crimes against humanity being depicted and really made a law, it will be, again, there will be impunity for these crimes in our part of the world.
Thank you very much. We're going to take 2 more questions and then go to the panel over here, and then if you can make the questions brief, that would be lovely.
Yes, thank you. James Sharp, Chatham House, London. My congratulations as well. It seems to me that the problem you discussed in various ways is magnified by the fact that so many of the countries that today take history seriously have a distorted view of it. In some cases, an authorized view of it. You don't have to have a Russian-style political system to have an authorized view of it. We can see one example taking shape inside the European Union. But there is a stark contrast between that deep but distorted historical knowledge on the one hand, and the situation in many other countries, including, if I may say so, my own, where the historical knowledge of the present generation is extraordinarily shallow. And I mean, as an example, I can think, as can you, of many distinguished diplomatic historians. But I hope I'm not insulting anyone in this room. It's very hard to think of any who are still alive, because this is not a discipline that is encouraged or studied in British universities anymore. And I doubt if the situation is very different in Denmark or in Sweden. So my question then is, this question of who owns history, is this not part of another question? Who owns education and who is responsible for it? Thank you.
Okay, and question up in front. Karl, did you want to come in with a question now? A remark. Okay.
No, just a remark, and I will abstain from going on the Danish-Swedish.
Are you going to dispute? You have a dispute with the Danish representative?
No, because I have the fundamental difficulties that my ancestors were part of Denmark at that particular time. Then they're brought into Sweden under circumstances.
European history is just too complicated.
But so we skip that particular one. But here's the remark that I think history is the most dangerous thing that we have in Europe. There's nothing as dangerous in Europe as history, because it's a dark force that lurks behind the surface. And as a phrase by Henry Kissinger that I picked up a long time ago, always find very useful, he said that nations exist not only in space but also in time. And nations have been formed by narratives where enemies are more important than friends. And those pictures of who were the enemies against the nation that we are part of, they linger. History owns us, as you pointed out. Sometimes there have been the attempts to overcome these divisions. I mean, French, German history commissions and common history books. Well, you are shaking your head slightly, but I mean, is often seen as successful. In modern times, I think one of the most successful was between Poland and Russia over Katyn. And some of these things which half succeeded, as a matter of fact. That was not an entirely easy subject. At the moment, there's a vigorous debate on Polish-Ukrainian, exceedingly complicated history. See if they can find some common view on it. I was quite involved in the Balkans. And therefore, while we had the rather naive idea of trying to get some historians together to write the history of the place, no way. No way. Oh, well, yeah. Simply, absolutely no way to doing it. So the only thing, there was set up a center that is still there in Thessaloniki, trying to sort of bring things together. And it went so far as to publish a number of volumes where you have the different narratives of the different nations on the same event, so that you don't sort of bring them together, because that is not possible, and perhaps not even constructive. Because what turned out to be interesting was to learn not history as a truth, but history as seen by the others, in order perhaps to understand the perspective of the others, knowing that you yourself are owned by your history, but they are owned by another version of the same history. And this will go on until such time as the historians can agree on the history. And I don't think that's the case. I think correct me, but I think the largest numbers of history books have been written on the subject of the fall of the Roman Empire, and there is still no agreement on why it happened.
Yeah, it brings to mind that Chinese, who was it, the Chinese official who said, asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he answers, it's too soon to tell. Okay, so there's a great variety of questions. We've got Edward Lucas' question about typology. Is it so important to classify the messianic brand, the reaction, the victimization narrative? Aren't they mixed, in fact, sometimes? Perhaps, Yuri, you'd like to pick that one up. Does any of you have any thoughts on Andre's fascinating question about producing laws to channel historical narratives and prevent certain, perhaps revisionist narratives from emerging? And the question of education and Karl's point about history is a danger. We don't think historians are a danger, but history may be a danger. So who would like to? Yuri, would you like to answer on that
Sure.
first point?
I agree with Uffe that most historians, myself included, believe in something called truth and search for it. But the relationship, as Marek pointed out correctly, I believe, between that effort and the various narratives that we hear coming from various quarters is a very complex one. And when Karl was saying that Polish and Ukrainian historians have to come to terms with each other's narratives and have to arrive at some sort of a consensus, that has not much to do with history as search for truth. This has to do with shaping, molding, manipulating, if you will, certain stories so they would meet halfway or somewhere in between. This is what in the Soviet Union was called the friendship of the peoples doctrine. It now reigns in the EU, of course, and that is politically understandable, rational, and useful, of course, but it has very little to do with the kind of history that academic or some academic historians do, and most of them understand that, and indeed there are all sorts of historians who do several things or pursue different kinds of history at once. Those who write textbooks for children pursue different goals, and textbook history is about making citizens, which is to say indoctrination, A, and B, about teaching them how to think, which is the opposite of indoctrination. So you figure how to go about doing that. But just to respond briefly to another point, actually several points to the same effect, the assumption that there is true history, meaning by that one set of narratives, as opposed to fake history or bad history, and legislate against the latter in order to achieve, and I quote, a correct assessment of Stalinism is, I'm sorry, Stalinism. That's, I mean, one or at least one good example of a time and a society when indeed there existed, well, you didn't really need legislation, but a party line on the correct assessment of Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, you name them. And finally, on the question of clashes, of course. And it is true, it goes both ways. In other words, if there is a conflict, histories begin to clash. And when histories clash violently enough, there may be a conflict. That's certainly true of the conflict of East Ukraine, where two views of the past are diametrically opposed, are very difficult to reconcile, especially in a situation when no one is really trying to do so.
Mike.
Or maybe just I'll add one more thing, that they clash when they are different, like the messianic, triumphalist, or the victimhood kind, to use my crude terminology. But even if they belong to the same category, perhaps even more so, right? One mythmaker's victim is another mythmaker's perpetrator. The existence of a victim presupposes the existing of a perpetrator, a role that not everyone is willing to take on. And as we know, victimhood thrives on uniqueness, and there is brutal competition for the role of victim in Europe, as we know.
Yeah, just a couple of short comments on various questions. First, I think the problem with the nation narratives is actually a complicated one, because, as you know, history writing and nation building goes hand in hand from the beginning of the nation building, and from academic history writing, meaning from the mid-19th century. And that's why we need more and more in nowadays this kind of comparative, multi-perspective history, and not a common one, meaning that the point is not to, how to say, merge all those national narratives into one European narrative, but to have different perspectives into same or similar events as Karl just proposed. And indeed, in order to avoid those clashes between different national narratives shaped over the last couple of centuries, we need to bring them together and have a kind of multi-perspective approach. That's the only solution I can see. And then about the, how to say, legislative measures, about the history laws. And I think it's not, again, about history, it's about memory politics. So if you like history politics, it's not about history at all in my mind. It's about how to resolve the current problems. It's a political issue, it's a legal issue. And historians have very little to say here. And myself, I'm rather reluctant towards those memory laws. I remember when French Parliament some years ago voted yet another memory law, how to treat the French colonial experience, then the former president, the president back then, Jacques Chirac, said very clearly, in this country, history is written by historians, not by legislators. And I very much subscribe to this point. But it doesn't mean that I underestimate the importance of dealing with past injustices, but it has to be done in a legal framework, like it was done in this committee that Uffe mentioned, when the crime against humanity accomplished in Estonia during the Second World War and post-war years was studied. It was very much about the crimes against humanity, not historical crimes or crimes in history. And therefore, any kind of trials or verdicts about history, not very reasonable way to proceed.
Well, I don't believe in legislation when it comes to protect history or to avoid falsifications. I believe in exposure. And exposure is best done by strong institutions and good education. So I think Jamie Shear is absolutely right that it's also a question of educating the next generation. And again, using the resources necessary. There's a very interesting experiment going on in the EU. That is the so-called East Stratcom initiative. If you don't read their weekly newsletters, I can recommend you to do so. It's wonderful reading because they expose all the attempts they run into when it comes to trying to fiddle with facts. It's very entertaining, and of course it is very controversial, and they are under heavy attack. Only recently somebody was very close to succeed in closing it down. So we need to be robust as well and insist not on legislation and rules, but on strong institutions and the necessary resources to expose what needs to be exposed.
Okay, there's several more questions. I would need just a sign from the organizers. How much time do we have left? Just if somebody can just wave a hand, or that's the amount of time we have left. Okay, thank you very much. So we're comfortable. So we'll take several questions. There's one here. Where was yes, the gentleman in the front. First, the gentleman in the front, please, and then we'll move.
Oh, the mic is already there.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see the microphone.
Well,
Please
I've been
go
very
ahead.
kindly given the microphone. I'm Judge
Sorry.
Sheflin, European Parliament. It's a question of ownership. My problem with ownership is that actually the very concept holds a danger, that it reduces history to the idea of there being a single overriding history, which then leads one into things like historical necessity, history as fate, and indeed projecting the present back on the past. Arendt has written about this. Marek, you will of course know this very well. So my question really, it's a provocative one. Marxist history, is it fake history? And secondly, you will all know that a certain person called Jean-Claude Juncker went to Trier to inaugurate a memorial paid for by the Chinese to Karl Marx. Now, this is clearly a site of memory. Fake, or are we importing Marx into the European Union, or what are we doing?
Okay, there's a question here. Can the microphone move forward to the front row, please? Yep. And then I'll come to you.
Thank you. Great panel. Charlie Sloane, Pasternak, Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I was inspired by the idea of Europeans to make a positive case, heroic inspiration that some events provide, that Mark mentioned and Yuri talked about, the one thing that all Russians can agree upon, at least, being the Great War, being great. It also occurs to me that there are 3 European countries where World War II history is basically positive. They also happen to be the 3 countries whose capitals were never occupied. So Moscow, of the belligerents, Moscow, London, and Helsinki. Is there a way to somehow positively harness this as you're writing the history for the next 100 years on a European level?
Okay, there was a question just in the lady there, please. And where else?
Thank you. I'm Anna Wisslander with the Atlantic Council, and I oppose a bit to Marek fragmented view, I would say, on not having a common history at all. We do have quite mature institutions. We have NATO turning 70 next year, reflecting perhaps the transatlantic community. We have the EU more than 60 years since the Treaty of Rome, a European project. So who owns history? Cannot the institutions own history by now?
Okay. There's a question right at the back. The gentleman there. Can a microphone get to him? Thank you so much.
Andrew Higgins, Moscow correspondent for the New York Times. There's been lots of discussion so far about the necessity of fighting fake history, combating phony narratives. So I'm wondering what the panel makes of events, the very strange events of the past few days in Kiev, where authorities said it was necessary to fake a story of the murder of a journalist. Are there occasions when the ends justify the means, i.e. it's okay to fake stuff if the ends are okay? In this case, supposedly exposing a Russian plot.
The Babchenko story.
The Babchenko.
Okay, okay, there's one more question here. Is there another one over there? No. Okay.
Thank you. Tengis Paladze from Georgia. Very short comment about post-Soviet nations. Maybe there are post-Soviet countries because of their style of governance of state institutions and so on, but there are no post-Soviet nations. Our nations has history quite longer, bigger, and stronger, as well as identity, bigger than Soviet occupation. Thank you.
Okay. So great. A great collection of questions. Who would like to start? Go ahead, Mark.
Again, first address George questions. I think these questions belong to different spheres. Marxist historiography, very fine with me. I mean, as fine as any other type of history writing. But of course, you have to argue, and there's always a chance to counter-argue that maybe an analyst or, let's say, hermeneutic historiography is better suited for this particular problem. But per se, I don't see any problem to adapt for Marxist historiography. But what comes to the Marx monument, this is, I would say, again, a question of memory politics. That's a political thing. And as an historian, I can only have an opinion as a citizen. And in my mind, it's not very excellent idea to celebrate in this particular setting this type of monument. But again, that's very personal opinion. And as an historian, I don't have any judgment on this. Then, I mean, if I say that in my mind we don't need a common European history, it doesn't mean that we need a fragmented European history. I mean, what we need a multi-perspective, comparative European history, combining different approaches, different experiences, and learning from each other's experiences. And of course, in a way, one can say that indeed institutions own history, but here again, I would like to introduce another distinction that is important for me between history and heritage. I would say that heritage is something that indeed belongs to us. That heritage is something that we, take care of, that we construct in a way that is important for us, that in a way our identity is connected to it, and we can say that Estonian heritage belongs to Estonians. It doesn't exclude the others, but this is something that is important for our identity. While history, let's say Estonian history, do not belong to Estonians. It belongs to everybody. And also when the NATO heritage belongs indeed to NATO, but NATO history does not belong to NATO only. And again, I think that's important. In history, I mean here academic study of the past. And you cannot say that now NATO has to approve whether this or that version of NATO's history is correct, nihil obstat. So indeed, so that's two short reactions. Thanks.
Yuri, would you like to comment on something?
Sure.
Post-Soviet nations?
Of course. On the question of ownership, I think any institution worthy of the name tries to lay some claims, make claims with regard to its past. It's, in today's world, I think, done most explicitly by people who object to what they call cultural appropriation. In my own institution at the University of California, Berkeley today, it's one of the biggest questions. Whose history can be told and by whom? And this is precisely the question that Marek has just raised, in this case, with some people questioning the neat distinction between the two and saying that our heritage, as we define it, is history, stay out. So, but of course, there are various ways of dealing with it. On the case of the post-Soviet nations, I, of course, was referring to states, not nations, and that was precisely my point, that when those states were formed, they restored and updated some very old narratives, some of which go very far back, some of more recent vintage. In the case of Georgia, the official Soviet history of Georgia, produced before World War II, contained a lot of those tropes, metaphors, stories that are in play today in Georgia.
Uffe, on the Ukrainian
journalist,
would you like to,
Russian journalist,
who was
murdered and then not yet murdered. All right. Yes, of course, it might be necessary every now and then to lie in a situation in order to smoke somebody out. But the point is that the truth come out in the end. Among politicians, it's a joke that one person is always allowed to lie. That is the finance minister in the old days before a devaluation of the national currency. Then it was a national duty to lie about it. But my point is the truth come out in the end, like it did in Kiev.
You weren't shocked by that episode? You didn't find that a bit strange?
I was amused.
You were amused?
Yeah, but having seen what I have seen in so many years,
I agree,
it takes a lot to shock.
I agree there can be more shocking things in today's world, but still it was...
I think it's an interesting point about the common history, because of course we should be able to share history about some things. But then I get back to the picture Karl painted before from Thessaloniki of all these different ways of telling a history. And I also get back to the old fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen about how one little feather can get into a number of full-fed hens. So history and narratives, it's a complicated matter. And therefore it's too complicated to be dealt with by journalists or politicians. And that's where we need you guys. And we need to perhaps strengthen the institutions that take care of making sure that the history is there to be seen and to be told. And their legislation could come in the way of that. Look at the Turkish example of the Armenian genocide, because it was a genocide that we are not allowed to talk about when we are in Turkey. So we need to spend much more resources and much more respect to the matter.
And what did you think about the question of as you know, institutions could possibly own the history? Was that your suggestion? Why not resort to institutions? You know,
no, they don't own it. They
NATO,
have the archives, and you have certain rules regarding archives. I'll never forget when there was this commission in Estonia to look at crimes against humanity, and where we talked about the first Soviet occupation, the German occupation, and the second and very long Soviet occupation. Well, for political reasons, we chose to start working on the German occupation because nobody could accuse the commission of what it was accused of course, nevertheless of being anti-Moscow. But still, looking in the archives there, I was not able to read the Russian archives, but there were hundreds and hundreds of meters of dusty archives. Marek, you have probably been there. And to see how things were kept there, old German reports that I were able to read and understand, gory tales that all went down into these volumes made by professional historians with this task that had been carved out to them. So that's the way I like history to be maintained and dealt with. So we have something to refer to whenever somebody tries to fix his history.
I'm not sure that I fully agree that this is the best example of how history should be done. When a government commissions work by historians and then tells them that you had better start with that occupation as opposed to the other one because we have certain interests involved. I mean, that's certainly one way to approach it, and that's what I was trying to talk about. But that has very little to do, again, with the work that historians do when they go again into those archives and keep disagreeing, as Mark said, with each other. And perhaps I could, apropos of this question, ask maybe one of you if there is a museum of Danish occupation in Sweden or the other way around.
Karl, get the microphone to Karl Bill, please, so we can have an answer.
Let me just correct you. It was not the Estonian government that directed the historians to start with this issue. They gave that away at arm's length to an international commission with a chairman from Finland, Max Jakobsson.
Oh well, that obviously changes things.
So, okay, so yeah. you agree on that one. You agree on that one. Okay.
Well, if you knew Max Jakobsson, you would know it changes things.
We'll have Max Jakobsson on the panel next year.
You can't, unfortunately.
Oh, he's not around anymore. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Is there any other question? I wanted to ask a question to our two historians. And basically, because I'm just curious, and maybe it could help enlighten some of the conversation. As historians, when you look into the past, into history, what are you trying to understand something about today, or are you just trying to find out more about the past? I mean, personally, in your work.
I mean, that's again. First of all, there is no chance to look at the past. The past is gone. But what we can do, of course, we can look at the traces left by the past. And I would say that this is probably truly a professional commitment, that you want to understand what happened, how it happened, why it happened. It's not to understand your present, it's understand this particular period. But, of course, the questions we pose to the past, the research theme we choose, to pursue are very much defined by the present occupation. I mean, the very fact that right now, one of the most important topics in history, it's about environmental history, it's about global history, it's about non-human history, all questions that are so important in our contemporary societies. Of course, those present-day situations dictate very much the questions we ask, we pose to the past, but of course, the answers must come from the past, not from the present.
Yuri?
Well, I agree.
You agree.
I mean, most historians, I think, would say that they're interested in the past, but they obviously live, and it's a banal thing to say, they live in the present, their readers live in the present, they interact in the present, and you can't divorce one from the other.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. I really want to thank you for these incredible contributions to a very wide-ranging and rich debate. I take away that comparative history is more important than common history, than looking for common history, to compare ourselves, our memories. Awareness of history through education is crucial. The freedom and the independence of historians is essential, right? There's no dictating to historians. When the minute you start doing that, you're preventing a genuine work of history to be undertaken. And I just want to thank the audience for the great questions and for being so active. Please join me in applauding our panelists. Okay.